Max was a dog who carried the marks of a life of abandonment on his body and soul. His hind paw dragged painfully along the ground, and his once shiny coat was dull and dirty. Every step he took was a struggle against the pain. But Max didn't give up. There was something about that morning that pushed him forward, something he didn't fully understand, but that made him keep going. The sun had barely risen on the horizon, and the streets were empty. The cold wind cut through his already battered skin, and hunger tightened his empty stomach. But none of that mattered. Max kept moving. Somewhere deep in his consciousness, he knew he needed help. His instincts guided him through the city's sidewalks until, exhausted, he spotted a building that seemed different from all the others. It was a veterinary clinic. The glass door was still closed, but to Max, that place represented something beyond walls and windows. There he felt he might find what he needed most: relief. He stumbled to the entrance, his body giving in with each new attempt to move. The smell of medicine and cleanliness that wafted through the cracks in the door mixed with Max's tired senses, awakening something in his memory. Perhaps at some point he had felt something similar when he was a puppy and belonged to a home. But those memories were too distant to grasp now. Max collapsed against the wall of the clinic. His body, out of strength, finally surrendered. His paws curled up against his chest, and his eyes began to close slowly. His breathing was weak, almost inaudible, and for a moment it seemed everything was about to end right there, in that forgotten corner of the city. But despite the intense pain, a spark of hope still shone within him, however small. He needed to be saved. Inside the clinic, Daisy, the young veterinarian, was getting ready for another day of work. Driven by her love for animals, she always arrived early, organizing instruments and checking security cameras before opening the doors. It was while checking the images from outside that something caught her attention. There was a dog lying next to the entrance, motionless. The state of that animal was alarming. Daisy rushed outside without hesitation, already imagining the worst. As she approached Max, she saw up close the deplorable condition he was in. His ribs were visible beneath his skin, and his hind paw seemed completely unusable. Daisy knelt beside him, trying not to frighten him, but Max didn't react. He was conscious, but appeared to be on the brink of collapse. "Easy, boy. I'm going to take care of you," she said in a soft voice, even though her heart was racing. It was clear that the dog was in a critical condition, and she needed to act fast. Max slowly opened his eyes upon hearing that gentle voice. It was the first time in a long while that someone cared about him. His breathing became a little stronger, as if that presence was giving him a new chance to fight. Daisy quickly examined him and realized he wouldn't be able to walk on his own. She then picked him up in her arms, feeling his weight was far too light for a dog of his size. Max didn't resist. On the contrary, he seemed to accept her care as his only salvation. Inside the clinic, Daisy placed Max on the examination table and began to assess him more thoroughly. The scars on his body indicated a history of mistreatment. His hind paw was severely inflamed and poorly healed, but what worried Daisy most was the look of pain in his eyes. She sensed there was something more going on. Max, for his part, looked at Daisy with a mix of fear and relief. He had never been in a place like that, but something in her expression gave him confidence. He wanted to fight, but his body was so tired that he could only hope that this time he wouldn't be rejected like so many times before. After the initial examinations, Daisy had to face a harsh truth. Max had a tumor. The dog, already weakened by abandonment, was also fighting against something invisible and much more deadly. She froze for a moment, watching that being who, despite being so mistreated by life, still found the strength to carry on. She stepped away from the table for a few seconds, trying to process the situation. Max needed immediate help, but the prognosis wasn't good. The tumor was advanced, and without treatment, he wouldn't have much time left. Daisy felt a tightness in her chest. She knew the battle would be tough, but something in Max's gaze, even in that state, made her decide she would fight for him. The next step was to start treatment. Daisy knew that time was not on their side, but she couldn't give up. Every minute counted, and Max needed to be strong enough to endure what was to come. Daisy began organizing the medications while watching Max from a distance. His body was weak, and his matted, dull fur barely moved with his heavy breathing. She knew that the decision to start treatment wouldn't be easy, but there was no other choice. Max was there with his eyes half closed, perhaps sensing that his life hung by a thread. He seemed ready to give up, but Daisy, on the other hand, was not. She approached him once more and gently ran her hand over Max's head. "I promise I'll do everything I can for you," she murmured, her voice choked with emotion. Max barely reacted to the touch, but for a brief moment his eyes sparkled. There was something there, a thread of hope that, however fragile, still existed. Daisy took a deep breath. She needed to be quick. The first treatment session was delicate. Max's body seemed to resist every new attempt to help, and Daisy feared he wouldn't endure much longer. The tumor was more advanced than she had initially imagined. The chances were slim, and the pain he felt was beyond what any animal should have to bear. Max, however, was somehow still fighting. He instinctively knew that Daisy was trying to save him. After the first round of chemotherapy, Max's body reacted unexpectedly. His fever began to rise, and he grew restless on the treatment table. Daisy noticed something was wrong. Desperate look in his eyes struck her like a sharp blade. It was as if Max was pleading for it all to end. She gently touched his head, trying to soothe him, but the feeling of helplessness consumed her. "I know it hurts, sweetheart. But please, just hang on a little longer," she said, her eyes starting to well up. Max was struggling, but the pain was visible in every whimper, in every trembling movement of his paws. Daisy watched him in silence, her hands clenched at her sides, unsure if what she was doing was enough. For a moment she wondered if she should really continue with the treatment. Max had already been through so much, and she feared she was prolonging his suffering. The dilemma settled in her heart, and doubt seemed to scream inside her mind. Lying on the treatment table, Max closed his eyes, exhausted. His body was so fragile, and the chemotherapy, though necessary, seemed to be draining the last drops of strength he had left. Daisy remained by his side, unable to leave the room. She felt trapped between the desire to save that animal and the fear of merely prolonging a pain he might not be able to bear. That night, alone in the clinic, Daisy sat on the floor beside Max. The dog, lying on a soft blanket, hardly moved. His breathing was irregular, as if each breath was a struggle. She couldn't take her eyes off him. There was something about this animal that touched a deep place within her, something she couldn't explain. Even after so many animals had passed through her hands, Max was different. He was a broken soul, marked by a past of suffering and abandonment, yet still there was a spark of life in him that stubbornly refused to go out. Daisy closed her eyes for a moment, trying to find strength. "Am I doing the right thing?" she whispered, as if Max could answer. The question hung in the air unanswered. The next morning Max was still alive, but his condition was critical. Daisy knew time was against them, and every minute counted. She examined the dog again, and her heart ached to see that he wasn't responding well to the treatment. The chances of recovery were slim, and for a moment she felt a deep despair. When the phone rang, she almost didn't answer. She was too tired to deal with anything else. But when she heard the voice of an old veterinary colleague, something inside her stirred. He had heard about an experimental treatment that, although risky, could be Max's last hope. Without wasting time, Daisy made the decision. There were no guarantees, but the prospect of a new attempt, however small the chance, reignited a flame within her. Max was still fighting, and she couldn't give up on him now, not after everything he had already endured. She looked once more at the dog, now motionless, and whispered, "You still have a chance. I believe in you." Daisy didn't waste any time. She consulted specialists who guided her about the experimental treatment, a risky procedure that could give Max a new chance. The weight of responsibility seemed to double on her shoulders, but she knew that if there was even a slight possibility of saving that dog, she would try. The new treatment required a series of delicate sessions, and each one felt like a battle in itself. The first few days were agonizing. Max's body fought against the very cure, and the reactions were intense. Daisy could hardly sleep, torn between the need to be by Max's side and the other patients in the clinic. But she always returned to him every night, sitting next to him and offering the only comfort she could, her presence. With each session, Max seemed to weaken a little more. His paws trembled, and sometimes he couldn't even lift his head. The look that once carried a spark of fight was now dimmer. His silence was painful for Daisy. "I know it hurts, boy," she whispered, gently stroking his ears, "but we have to keep going. You can do it. Just a little longer." But with each passing day, the uncertainties grew. She watched Max slowly sink, and the doubts that had already begun to creep into her mind now became deafening. Her heart tightened at seeing him like this, and one question she had been avoiding became increasingly unavoidable. Would he endure until the end? Daisy began to wonder if she was forcing Max into a fight he couldn't win. The moments when Max showed any improvement were brief, quickly followed by more severe setbacks. He became more and more fragile, with a fever that came and went, and his low, intermittent whimpers broke Daisy's heart. There were nights when she simply sat on the floor beside him, battling tears and questioning whether she was being selfish for pushing him through this treatment. Each labored breath from Max sounded like a silent plea. But one morning, something changed. When Daisy arrived at the clinic, the silence that had enveloped everything for the past few days was interrupted by the soft sound of Max's paws shuffling across the floor. He was trying to stand. His movements were slow, hesitant, but he was moving. Daisy rushed to him, her heart racing. It was the first real sign of recovery in a long time. She knelt beside him, encouraging him gently. "That's it, boy. You're doing great." Max managed to get on his feet, even if just for a brief moment. His legs trembled and he almost fell back, but there was something different about him in that moment. A renewed strength. Daisy didn't know if it was just a brief flash of energy or a true sign that he was getting better, but it didn't matter. Seeing Max standing, even if only for a few seconds, ignited something within her. Maybe the struggle hadn't been in vain after all. In the days that followed, Max experienced small victories. He began to eat better, his eyes regained a faint sparkle, and Daisy finally caught a glimpse of the possibility of a full recovery. It was still early to celebrate, but hope, which had once felt distant, was beginning to draw closer again. The long nights of worry gave way to a quiet expectation. Max was fighting, and each small progress was silently celebrated by Daisy. "You're a warrior, Max," she said, watching as he ate with a bit more appetite. "I knew you had this in you." However, even with these small triumphs, Daisy knew the battle was far from over. Max's tumor had responded to treatment, but he was still a long way from being out of danger. And while he fought to recover, Daisy couldn't shake the constant fear that he could have a relapse at any moment. Yet, in that moment, she chose to hold on to hope. Max's recovery days continued to be an emotional roller coaster. With every small advance, a shadow of uncertainty lingered in the air, as if any progress could be reversed at any time. Daisy understood that even with the treatment working, his condition remained delicate. But each movement, no matter how minor, was a victory, and she decided that, for now, she would cling to that. One afternoon, while he was lying in the treatment room, Daisy watched him in silence. Max was breathing more easily, and his eyes followed Daisy's movements around the clinic, as if he were more aware of his surroundings. She noticed that something had changed. He wasn't resigned to pain and lethargy as before. There was a glimmer in his eyes, still faint but visible. That gaze conveyed a will to continue. It was on that same afternoon that Max took a crucial step. While Daisy had her back turned, listening to the latest test results, Max stood up on his own. With effort, he walked towards her, each step painful but firm. Daisy heard the soft sound of his nails scratching against the floor, turned around, and upon seeing Max standing, her eyes filled with tears. "Max." The word escaped her lips almost like a sigh. He paused beside her, and for a moment it seemed like he was seeking some kind of acknowledgement, as if he wanted to show that he was fighting alongside her. Daisy crouched down, enveloping him in a gentle hug, and the warmth of that contact filled the void of the last days of uncertainty. "You're coming back. I knew you could do it." In the days that followed, Max began to eat better, and his strength seemed to return bit by bit. But Daisy didn't allow unbridled optimism to take hold. She knew Max's body was still in recovery, and any mistake or oversight could be fatal. The fight was still not won. Then the head veterinarian returned with the news from the latest tests. Max's tumor had significantly shrunk. The experimental treatment, which had initially seemed like a shot in the dark, was working beyond expectations. It was a victory that Daisy didn't even have the courage to celebrate openly. The news made her stop for a few seconds, processing the idea. They were winning. However, what was meant to be a relief brought with it a new wave of anxiety. Max could have real chances of survival, but the fragility of his condition was still a risk. With each day he grew stronger, Daisy found herself increasingly worried about the possibility of a sudden relapse. She understood that Max's body had been pushed to its limits, and there was a fine line between recovery and collapse. One night, while Daisy prepared the space for another light chemotherapy session, Max surprised everyone at the clinic once again. He not only stood up, but he walked toward the door. Daisy followed him, concerned yet curious. He looked at her for a moment, as if asking her to let him go further this time. With hesitation, she opened the door that led to the small garden beside the clinic. Max slowly ventured outside, the cool night air brushing against his fur. His steps were cautious, but he was walking on his own, as if he wanted to remind himself and Daisy that he was still there, that he wanted to live. Daisy watched with her heart racing, torn between fear and hope. Max seemed to be testing his own limits, taking slow but steady steps, sniffing the air with a curiosity she hadn't seen in a long time. When he finally stopped and lay down on the cool grass, Daisy approached and sat beside him in silence. What was he trying to show her? That he was ready to move forward? That he could fully recover? Or perhaps he was simply seeking a moment of peace, away from the pain and medical procedures. She wasn't sure, but in that moment, all Daisy could do was be present, silently hoping that the worst was truly behind them. After a while, Max looked at her, as if he were tired, but not in the way she was used to seeing. It was a physical tiredness, from a body that had fought so hard, but now just needed rest. Daisy helped him to his feet, and gently guided him back inside the clinic. As she settled him onto his soft blanket, the veterinarian whispered softly, "You're almost there, Max. We're almost there." However, little did Daisy know that fate still had one last twist in store for them. The next day, Daisy felt more confident than ever. After months of struggle, it finally seemed that Max was winning the hardest battle of his life. He was not only getting up and walking, but also showing signs of emotional recovery. His eyes, once dull from pain and exhaustion, were now brighter. He moved through the clinic with a serene calmness, as if he understood that a new chance at life lay ahead of him. Daisy decided it was time to think about Max's future. She loved the dog deeply, but knew she needed to find him a permanent home, someone who could give him the attention and affection he so richly deserved. She had received an inquiry from a man who showed great interest in adopting him. She scheduled an interview, even though deep down something inside her hesitated. There was a bond between them that went beyond the professional. Taking care of Max had become part of her routine, part of her life. As she awaited the day of the interview, Daisy tried not to think too much about what would happen if he was actually adopted. "It will be best for him," she repeated to herself, convincing herself that Max's complete recovery would be the perfect conclusion to their journey. But that feeling of unease lingered. On the eve of the meeting, Daisy decided to take Max for a walk, a small ritual they had adopted in recent weeks now that he was stronger. The air was calm, and they walked side by side, as if sharing a silent peace. Max sniffed the ground relaxedly, something simple yet so meaningful. Each step he took was proof that all their efforts had been worth it. Suddenly, without warning, Max stopped. Daisy noticed he was trembling slightly, as if something was wrong. Before she could react, he collapsed onto his side, his body convulsing. Daisy's heart raced and she knelt beside him in a panic. "Max!" she called, but he didn't respond. She tried to hold his head, preventing him from hurting himself during the seizure. The feeling of helplessness overwhelmed her completely. All the progress, all the little victories, seemed to slip through her fingers in that moment of despair. Max appeared to be on the brink of collapse. His breathing was erratic, his body rigid, and Daisy feared he wouldn't survive. The scene was devastating. "Please, Max, stay with me." Her voice trembled as tears welled up in her eyes. The fear of losing him at that moment was crushing. She knew that if he didn't come out of this crisis soon, there would be nothing more to be done. Seconds felt like hours, until, slowly, Max's body began to relax. The spasms diminished, and he lay still. His breathing was still heavy, but he opened his eyes weakly. Daisy let out a relieved sigh, but the fear still gnawed at her chest. She carefully scooped him into her arms and rushed him back to the clinic, racing against time. Back in the office, Daisy did everything she could to stabilize him. She quickly reviewed all the previous tests, trying to understand what had happened. The cancer had seemingly lessened, but there was something she hadn't noticed before. An underlying heart problem, something that could be a late complication of the intensive treatment. "Is this why you had that seizure?" she whispered, her voice titrer. "I didn't see this before, I'm sorry." Now the fight was against time again. Max's heart was under pressure, and Daisy feared he wouldn't endure. Surgery could solve the problem, but he was too weak for it. She was once again faced with an impossible choice: risk the surgery or let him go peacefully. Daisy fell silent for a moment, watching Max breathe, his chest rising and falling slowly. He had fought so hard, and she couldn't believe that this new threat could take him away. "Not now, you deserve more than this." She made a decision. She would take the risk. She quickly called a trusted surgeon who agreed to perform the procedure as soon as possible. Time was against them, but Daisy refused to give up. Max still had a chance, however slim it might be. Hours later, the veterinarian arrived, and Max was prepared for surgery. Daisy was by his side, holding his paw. "I'm here, Max. You won't go through this alone." Daisy waited outside the surgery room, feeling the weight of the moment on her shoulders. The silence was thick, and the fear of losing Max seemed to fill every corner of the room. She clenched her hands, trying to calm the whirlwind of thoughts that wouldn't let her be at peace. She had done everything she could, but still, the feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. Time passed slowly, and every minute felt like a test of her patience and hope. Finally, the door opened, and the surgeon stepped out with a neutral expression. Daisy stood up immediately, her heart racing. He took a deep breath before speaking. "The surgery was a success, but he will need a lot of monitoring. He's still not out of danger." Daisy's legs nearly gave way from the relief she felt. Although she knew the battle was far from over, this small victory was everything she needed at that moment. Max was alive, and that was already a miracle. She entered the recovery room, where he lay sedated on the table, breathing slowly and steadily. Leaning closer, she gently touched his paw, feeling his warmth, a silent confirmation that, at least for now, he was still there. The following days were a test of patience and vigilance. Max responded slowly to recovery, and every small progress was met with a mix of hope and apprehension. Daisy stood by his side, watching, caring, and gradually he began to open his eyes more frequently. The bond between them, forged through months of struggles and uncertainties, was growing even stronger. Daisy felt that this fight was not just Max's, it was hers too. A few days after the surgery, he managed to get up for the first time. Still weak but determined, Daisy held her breath as she watched him attempt to walk. When he looked at her with those deep, vibrant eyes, tears began to well up in hers. "You're here. You made it, Max." He approached slowly, resting his head against her legs, as if to say he understood all she had done for him. Daisy knelt down and wrapped him in a hug. The weight of what they had overcome together was overwhelming, and in that moment, she knew she would never let him go again. The adoption interview had been cancelled. Max would belong to no one but Daisy. The thought of handing him over to someone else no longer made sense. They had gone through something that connected them forever. She couldn't imagine her life without him by her side. And so, on a quiet morning, with Max slowly walking through the garden, Daisy realized that the nightmare had finally ended. He was there, alive, strong, ready for a new life, and she would be a part of it. The dog that once arrived at the clinic on the brink of death now had a home, not with a stranger, but with the person who had believed in him the most from the beginning. She smiled, watching as Max lay down in the grass and gazed up at the sky, as if he could finally relax, as if he knew that the pain and suffering were behind him. We hope you enjoyed this narrative. Please show your support by liking and subscribing to the channel so you won't miss more emotional stories that touch the soul. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. We'd love to hear what you think. And we welcome your thanks and critiques too. We'll see you in the next heartwarming video. Until then.